So, hello and welcome to the first episode of this new series, explaining studies in a lot simpler way. Name pending. But essentially what I'm going to try to do here is take a development in neuroscience and try to explain it as normally as I possibly can. So, as episode 1 begins, our topic today is going to be understanding brain microstructures in autism. So, let's start off with what is autism? Well, autism is actually a wide range of conditions, collectively known as ASD, Autism Spectrum Disorder, and essentially it's a condition or group of conditions that affects communication, social interaction, behavior, and learning. Autism presents in different people in a variety of different ways, which is why it's known as a spectrum, but in essence, it's a neurodevelopmental disorder that affects how people are able to communicate and are able to learn. So, this study's goal was to understand the roles of specific microstructures into brain and attempting to use them as physical markers of the condition. So, to start with, we should understand what some of these microstructures actually are. But before that, we should cover a few important terms for this. So, conduction velocity is the speed at which impulses travel down a neuron. So, for anyone who doesn't understand, a neuron is a brain cell, essentially, and the way that signals get between neurons is through electrical impulses traveling from the front end of the neuron, called dendrite, through the axon, which is the long part, and getting to the axon terminal at the end, where they pass off that information to another brain cell to repeat that. Essentially, conduction velocity is the speed at which that electrical signal travels through the neuron. Imagine it like cars on a highway. The more efficient the road is, the faster traffic moves, the faster each individual car will be moving. And that's typically a good thing for the road as a whole, because slow impulses lead to traffic. A second thing that is important to this is extracellular water. Now, extracellular water might sound complicated, but it's essentially exactly what it sounds like. Extra, outside, cellular, from the cell, and water, meaning about exactly what it sounds like. So, this extracellular water is just water floating around between cells in the brain rather than being contained in any one of them. And essentially, the purpose of this is that it's another one of the small structures you could find that affects cooperation between cells. After all, the way that cells communicate is by chemicals transmitted between different cells. So if there's water between those cells, it could cause issues with the communication between different neurons, which could potentially have an effect on cognitive ability. The next important term is known as the G ratio. Essentially, what the G ratio is the proportion between how thick the axon is and how thick the myelin sheath is around it. Essentially, the myelin sheath is a layer of fat that insulates the axon like actual insulation on a wire, and it's sectioned up into small chunks that travel down the neuron and help electrical signals speed down it faster, improving the conduction velocity. It essentially serves the exact same function as insulation on a real wire. Other studies have found that the optimal ratio for as best conduction velocity as possible is around 0.77. This means that the thickness of the axon should be around 77% the thickness of the axon and the myelin sheath combined. So, after all this, the results of the study found out that people with autism have decreased G ratios and therefore conduction velocities, and increased amounts of cellular water in a lot of places throughout their brain. It also, incidentally, found a new way to calculate G ratios using diffusion MRI techniques. Finally, it suggested that autism could be predicted or diagnosed by looking for these variances in certain parts of the brain. Specifically, the parts of the brain that were most heavily affected by these microstructures were the corpus callosum, which is between the two hemispheres of the brain that send signals between those two, the frontal lobe, which is responsible for executive function, the temporal lobes, which is responsible for understanding and hearing language, and the parietal lobes, which help process sensory information and your understanding of where things are in space. Overall, these differences in microstructures could explain a lot of the challenges that people with autism spectrum disorder face in communication and behavior. The sources for all this are in the description below the video. And that's all for today.